Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett. Thank you for joining me for another episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I truly appreciate it. Today I'm going to be talking about my favorite aspect of ufology, and that is onboard encounters. And in fact, I call this one 7 Incredible Onboard UFO Encounters. These are the cases that are, to me, not only the most interesting, but have the most information and certainly have the most potential to answer all of the many questions surrounding UFO contact, such as who are the ETs? Where do they come from? Why are they here? What is their agenda on this planet? These cases provide a real deep insight into what it's like to have ET contact. I've picked 7 cases from all over the world, including Argentina, Brazil, England, Russia, and 3 from the United States, including Montana, Missouri, and 1 case that's actually a 2-parter taking place in both Wisconsin and Illinois. These are cases that reach all the way back to 1913, all the way up to 2011. So some old cases and some fairly recent ones as well. And again, these cases have so much information, and I think they represent the cutting edge of UFO research. We really dive deep into the heart of the phenomenon with cases like these. I think it's time we take them seriously because there are so many of them, and there's so much we can learn from them. So let's just get going, and I'll start with the first case, which I call Peace Be With You. This is the on-board UFO encounter of J.L. Buick. This is actually a multiple witness case. There are 2 witnesses. Only 1 witness came forward. It took place in July of 1913 in Badlands, Montana. I like this case because it is a very early case, predating the modern age of UFOs, at a time when this subject wasn't in the media really at all. The idea of UFOs and extraterrestrial visitations was just beginning to appear at this time. So that makes this a really important case. And there's also some really interesting aspects to it that I think are quite important. The case comes from respected researcher Donald Kehoe, who on September 24, 1956, received a letter from a Mr. J.L. Buick, a prospector who described his encounter, which had occurred actually 43 years earlier, way back in July of 1913. And according to this prospector, he was in the Badlands area of the state of Montana with another prospector when they were both surprised by the appearance of a, quote, small brown man, who approached them and said the words, "Peace be with you, my friends." And looking beyond the little man, these 2 prospectors saw a silver round craft, quite large, about 100 feet in diameter. It had a central dome on top, a conning tower, and it sat on a patch of sand on the ground. Now around the craft were several other little guys of the same appearance. They were busy picking up samples of various flowers and pebbles and things. A few appeared to be busy mining a nearby rock outcropping. Now this little man told the prospectors that he and his companions were actually from another planet, and that they had been secretly monitoring the Earth for more than 100 years. And per J.L. Buick, this man told him that they had learned to speak English by infiltrating a circus in the United States, where they had worked for some time. After this short conversation, the little man and the others returned to the craft, which promptly took off. But that's not the end of this story, because the next day the craft returned, and this time J.L. and his friend were both invited on board the craft by the little men, and, he says, given a tour of the interior. And per J.L. Buick, the interior of this craft contained 5 concentric saucers, each with diminishing air pressure, while the outermost section was actually a vacuum. Now the ETs said that rockets were not a feasible method for travel, and instead they used an electromagnetic drive, which allowed them to travel in excess of 9,000 miles per hour. They said they were able to produce artificial gravity inside the saucer, and said that, quote, gravity is only a different type of magnetism. Unfortunately, Donald Kehoe never published this case. As far as I know, he never even commented on the letter he received or interviewed the witnesses. But nevertheless, it remains a very intriguing early report, which does match up in some ways with modern-day cases. Such an amazing case. It's a shame Donald Kehoe didn't dive deeper into it, interview the witnesses firsthand, write about it. Would have loved to have talked to J.L. Buick, because I am sure there's a lot more information than was shared in his very brief letter to Donald Kehoe. But certainly an interesting and important case, which I like because his description of how this craft is powered using electromagnetics and this sort of thing very much echoes modern day cases. So now let's move to the next case, which is also super fascinating and I think pretty well known in the country where it took place, of Brazil. I call this case God is Only One, the onboard UFO encounter of Mario Restier. This took place on December 4, 1949, outside of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And such a fascinating and really extensive encounter with all kinds of information to it. The witness in this case is Mario Restier. He's a 23-year-old man from Barra Mansa, Brazil. It was on 5 p.m. on December 4, 1949, and Mario was returning to his home after visiting his father's farm in Volta Redonda. Now, both these locations are near Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and Mario had just begun his journey home when he saw a large saucer-shaped craft hovering above a grove of trees along the highway. He said it was quite large, 45 to 50 feet wide, just under 40 feet in height, he estimated, and as he watched, it landed in perfect silence, only about 30 to 40 feet away from the road. At the same time, Mario heard a telepathic voice in his head, speaking in his native language of Portuguese, and it said, "Don't be afraid. Do you want to know what it is? We know that you trust and believe in us." So Mario stopped his vehicle, got out, and began to approach the craft. Immediately a door opened in the side, and two humanoid figures appeared. He described these figures as having large bald heads, dark eyes, and they were wearing a sort of Roman-looking kilt and a round cap or helmet. He said they were about his height, 5.5 feet. They beckoned to him in a friendly way, seeming to invite him to enter. And the first thing Mario did was ask them if they believed in God. And they replied with the phrase, "God is only one." So encouraged by their response, he followed them and they led him into the craft. Now, one report on the case says he was at first frightened and resisted going on board. In any event, he was taken into the craft through a corridor to a room that he said was filled with screens, luminous squares and buttons, what looked like a globe and maps. He said the UFO occupants pushed some of these buttons, which caused various diagrams to appear on the screens, which were apparently monitors that showed the locomotion and navigation of the craft. These beings asked Mario if he would like to take a journey with them, and Mario agreed on the condition that he was brought back safely. The occupants agreed and placed Mario, still fully clothed, in a kind of tank or glass-looking bathtub, which was filled with a strange liquid. They told him it would protect him from the discomfort of accelerations and would nourish his body. So he got into the tank and they submerged him almost completely, with the exception of his eyes and nose. At this point, Mario fell asleep or lost consciousness, and when he woke up, he was told that they were just arriving. So they pulled him from the tank and into the next room, and to Mario's amazement, his clothes were immediately dry. Despite this, they gave him an outfit to wear, the same type of clothing they had on, including shoes, which to Mario looked almost like they had wires connected to a side belt. Now, per Mario, the clothes were very comfortable against his body. He then looked out a porthole and saw what appeared to be a spaceport, a sort of hangar, with various saucer-shaped craft, very much like the one he was arriving. He saw these craft arriving and departing, and looking around him, he got a shock, because he now saw that the figures that had been in the room with him were now seated on a kind of sofa, and their heads and bodies were slumped forward, motionless, as if they were dolls that had been switched off. But immediately a door opened and 6 human-looking figures walked in. They were smiling, wearing green-colored outfits. He said they were friendly, very kind, displayed a sense of humor, and spoke out loud in a kind of musical sing-song voice, saying, "We are happy with your coming. We are at your disposal." So they led Mario from the craft and began to give him a tour of the area. Mario said he was shown what appeared to be various factories and stores and establishments. While he was at the factory, he was given a kind of candied squash to eat. He was also given a small squarish piece of metal. He says he saw men, women, and children. They all looked human, except they had no body hair, and all of them were wearing a cap on their heads. He saw some people apparently levitating or traveling through the air. He saw what looked like vehicles traveling along suspended roads. He was almost immediately then taken to an apparent museum of some kind, into a room which was apparently devoted to knowledge of the planet Earth. He says the ETs pushed various buttons which projected images of Earth and the people on it, which demonstrated the characters of humans, such as people's feelings and ambitions, the level of violence and evolution that was going on our planet. Mario was told that thousands of millions of years ago, the ET's planet and the Earth's were much closer, but that a solar system-wide disaster had displaced Earth to another solar system. And they said that their planet was in the constellation Orion, and that in fact Russian astronomers on Earth had already located it. So Mario asked all kinds of questions, and the ETs responded. They explained to him that Einstein's theories were mostly correct, but needed minor adjustments. They said that the universe was finite, that space was curved. They said space travel was accomplished by using, quote, the vital energy of the body. They told him that people go through, quote, several vital cycles. He believed they were explaining reincarnation. And they said that their average lifespan was about 300 years, largely because they ate purified and clean food. He said it appeared to him that there was a large transparent dome covering the city he was in, but he did see blue sky. After about 8 hours, Mario began to feel homesick. He wanted to go home. And as if on cue, as if they were reading his mind, they told him, "We know that you are desirous of returning to your planet." And the 6 men led him back onto another ship, which was pretty much identical to the one he had arrived in, and told him goodbye. He did notice with some interest that none of them seemed to be leaders, that everyone all worked in cooperation. So back in the craft, he was taken to the tank full of liquid and was again submerged. He fell asleep, and when he woke up, he stepped out. His clothes again were dry. He took them off and put on his original Earth clothes, and then he was released from the craft just a kilometer or 2 from where he was first taken. So he immediately went back to his father's farm and received an incredible shock. In fact, his father scolded him for having disappeared for so long without telling anyone where he was. Mario believed that he could not have been gone for more than a few days. He only really remembered about 8 hours. But he now discovered that it was now April 14, 1950. He had been missing for about 4 months. So Mario told his incredulous father what happened. His father was shocked, somewhat skeptical, but Mario showed him the piece of metal he had been given, which did help convince his father of the veracity of his story. They, of course, tested the metal, subjecting it to flames, couldn't melt it, could not break it. Despite all this, Mario's father advised his son to keep the whole experience a secret. Now, Mario agreed, but he did learn that there were numerous sightings in the area at the time of his encounter, which helped provide some corroboration. There were some interesting after effects too, because following this encounter, Mario says he felt compelled to study general physics, nuclear physics, optics, and electronics, all kinds of sciences, in order to construct a new engine based on the engine of the craft he had seen inside this other craft. So eventually he got a job in the iron and steel industry, and one evening Years later, in September 1956, he said he had a second contact. He was driving when he saw a craft and had a strong feeling to stop and walk off the road, and he came upon this landed craft. He saw one of these UFO occupants standing outside of the craft who told him, and I quote, "Mario, you are again in union with us with respect to your project to build an engine. You can go ahead with it. We will be watching. It will never be used for the bad of the people of Earth." So Mario asked the UFO occupant about this curious time discrepancy of his last contact, and the ET told him that this was an effect of, quote, space-time contraction and the synchronism of time. So Mario didn't fully understand this, but following this experience, he did not tell anyone. He didn't contact the press, but he later made contact, he says, with a Miss Sharp from a foreign embassy who he shared his experience with her, and she offered to give him the facilities and finances to go ahead with the building of his engine. But yeah, Mario did not go public, and he would never have if he hadn't been contacted by researcher Dr. Walter Bueller, who heard about the case through a family member of Mario's. So Mario agreed to share his experience with Dr. Bueller and told him that the principle of the ET engine involved two atomic reactors rotating around an axis which would create two magnetic fields, one vertical and one horizontal, and this would create a field large enough to neutralize Earth's gravity. But he said that they would also need a large battery to help facilitate travel. Now Mario believed that this engine could be built in a matter of about 4 years, though there's no indication that he ever started or completed it. Also, Dr. Walter Bueller says that he did not have the opportunity to examine this alleged metal fragment. Nevertheless, Dr. Bueller did believe Mario's experiences and said, and I quote, "Senior Mario impressed us favorably as a stable and sincere man, but we cannot judge the technical aspects involved as we have not seen or examined the interplanetary artifact that he says he brought back from his trip." Mario himself says his experiences were entirely benevolent, and given the opportunity he would go back with the ETs, as quote, "There is so much to learn with them and about them." Such an amazing case, very well investigated. It's a shame that piece of metal, alleged piece of metal, was never publicly revealed. I wonder where it is now. I also find it interesting that Mario says he was given instructions on how to build a sort of UFO motor, because this does turn up in a number of cases. Also a shame that this apparently never came to fruition, but absolutely a fascinating case and one that deserves to be very well known. Now let's move to the next one, which is really unusual. I had not heard of this case. I call this case a strange occurrence. The onboard UFO encounter of Commander Horatio R. Penrose. This took place on May 13, 1954, near Derby, England. This turned out to be a pretty big year for UFO encounters, predating the amazing French UFO wave of late 1954. But yeah, this case has some really interesting aspects to it. The sole witness in this case is Commander Horatio Penrose, who at the time of his encounter lived at 17 Lonsdale Road in Birmingham, UK. His onboard encounter was surrounded by a series of unusual events. In fact, at 8 p.m. on May 12, 1954, the day before his encounter, Commander Penrose went to visit a pub in Derbyshire. And while he was there, he engaged in conversation with another gentleman and at some point began to talk about his car, a 1-year-old black Vauxhall Wyvern saloon. Now this man wanted to purchase Horatio's vehicle and made a very generous offer. But Horatio was undecided, he wanted to think it over for a day, and agreed to meet the man at the same pub the following evening. The gentleman agreed, and the next evening they did. They met at the pub, and the gentleman then invited Commander Penrose over to his house for tea, where he met the gentleman's wife. They had tea. According to Horatio, this seemed to be an ordinary English couple, though smaller than average. But after chatting, Horatio decided that he would not sell his vehicle, and he told his host so. And he left their house around 10:30 p.m. Again, this is May 13, 1954. And he was driving along the Derby Burton Road in the direction of Birmingham. And as he did so, suddenly he noticed a bright, unidentified light ahead of him on the highway. And in fact, as soon as he saw it, it appeared to be heading directly towards him. And as Horatio says, "As it reached my position, I experienced what seemed to be a crash, and I was thrown forward against the windscreen. Then the car seemed to be lifted from the ground, and I was moving through the air with a bright light above me. The next thing I remembered was when I had recovered consciousness in the Derbyshire Royal Infirmary, where I had stitches and a cut in my forehead." So there were some other injuries on his head, which were actually sufficient to keep Horatio in the hospital for, quote, "some months." Now, at first, Horatio did report some amnesia of this incident. But there were some other very strange details. Doctors and police were puzzled not only by Horatio's description of this apparent bright light coming towards him, but because the interior of the car contained an abnormally large amount of blood, far more than would have been expected from the injuries sustained by Horatio. So the police and doctors asked him if there possibly could have been more than one person in the car, but Horatio vehemently denied this. He was alone in the car, and was following the accident that he began to have recall of a strange event which occurred immediately after the accident had apparently happened. As Horatio says, "I remembered a strange occurrence which must have taken place immediately after my crash. At the moment the car was perched on some iron railings, I recollect being lifted from it by a man in a one-piece suit. He seemed to lift me effortlessly into an entrance on the underside of a large round vehicle which was hovering above us and giving out a bright light." So the next thing Horatio knew, he was inside a small room. He saw strange controls in it. He saw other figures also dressed in one-piece suits, both male and female. They were operating these strange controls. He says they appeared to be human-looking, had short hair. Horatio does remember that they were asking him questions about his experience in the Navy working with radar. He believes that they were speaking to him telepathically, not audibly. The last thing he remembered before waking up in the hospital was one of the beings coming up to him and injecting his arm with some sort of green fluid. Now, during his own investigation of the incident, he returned to the scene of the alleged accident, hoping to find some other witnesses. And he did. He found a railway signalman who said that at the time of Horatio's accident, he had in fact seen a car, presumably Horatio's, with an extremely bright light above it, go past his signal box at about the same level. What I like about that case is we have a very reputable, credible witness who really had no interest in publicity. It's also undeniable that something really unusual happened. I mean, the evidence surrounding this case is pretty clear that this was an unusual event of some kind. So that alone makes it a really important case. Now let's move to the next one, which I call "These Were Not Earth People." This is another fairly early case because at this time, again, onboard UFO encounters had not really become a big part of our culture, certainly not like they are today. I call this one "These Were Not Earth People, the Onboard Encounters of Mimi Gorzel." This took place on May 30th, 1965 at Mason Lake, Wisconsin. And there's a sequel to it which took place a few months later on September 3rd, 1965 in Des Plaines, Illinois. This is largely a single witness case, so apparently there were other people involved who have not come forward. But it's a very unusual case, though in many ways it does echo a lot of the cases we do see today. This very interesting, complex, and unusual case comes from researcher Fred Merritt of the Center for UFO Studies, QFOS, and it involves two main incidents. The first occurred at 2 p.m. on the afternoon of May 30, 1965, as the main witness, Mimi Gorzel, she was 45 years old at the time, she was sunbathing on the roof of her lakeside cottage, which was located by Mason Lake in Marquette County, Wisconsin. This is an 882-acre lake with a maximum depth of about 9 feet. And this is when she suddenly noticed a shiny metallic disc-shaped object approaching her in a beeline from over the lake. And as it approached, she saw that it was quite large, an estimated 40 feet wide, had a dome on top, a row of portholes around the middle, and this craft was hovering in perfect silence. She said it looked like the central disc seemed to be rotating, although the rest of it was stationary. And as Mimi says, it came into view so swiftly I could do nothing but stare at it. This object came right up to her cottage, less than 200 feet away, she estimates. And she watched in amazement as a sort of tripod landing gear seemed to emerge from the bottom of the craft, and it looked to her like it was about to land right next to her cottage. She was in fact now standing above the craft looking down on it. And this is when she noticed something very interesting. A figure appeared in one of the windows, and it beckoned to another figure inside the craft, and a second figure appeared next to an adjacent window. Per Mimi, both these figures were quite short. They had large bald heads, a small nose, just a slit for a mouth, and they stared directly at her for what seemed to her to be a pretty long time. As she says, they seemed to be talking to each other, and to me too. I wondered what they were saying, and even wished they would land, but they did not. I really wanted to go talk with them. We stared at one another for a good 15 minutes, although they also looked all around the area. Now the next thing Mimi knew, without warning, this object was racing away. She watched it fly off rapidly in the direction of the setting sun. And this surprised her because it was 2 p.m. when she saw this thing, and looking at the clock, it's now almost 6 p.m. She was missing approximately 4 hours of time. Now she wanted to go downstairs and tell her family, but she was embarrassed, and as she says, it was my secret, and I felt too foolish to tell anyone of it. However, following this experience, Mimi began to meditate. She essentially put herself under self-hypnosis, she says, and she was able to remember some of what happened during this missing time. She remembered coming down from the roof of her cottage and walking up to this landed craft. She said the two short occupants were each about 4 feet tall, actually led her up into the craft via a sort of stairway. Inside the craft, she said one of the beings was holding a small box. He opened it in front of her, and inside was what looked like a dark-colored crystal. She said it seemed to give off a kind of vapor or smoke. And one of these little guys held it up to Mimi's face. This alarmed her. She jumped back, but the occupant then passed this object in front of her face again, and Mimi said she could not detect any odors or fumes from this sort of mist or smoke coming off of it. And the next thing she remembers was being back on her roof watching this craft depart. Following this incident, she did suffer from some headaches, but that was it. She ended up writing a letter about her experience in the November 1972 issue of Fate magazine, which of course led her to being interviewed by Fred Merritt. That's not the end of her encounter, because it was just 3 months later when she had a follow-up experience that was even more strange. She had gone to bed for the evening like normal, but suddenly woke up to find that she was driving down a rural asphalt road, apparently near her home in Des Plaines, Illinois. As Mimi says, I came to the realization in the middle of the night and found myself driving on a very dark and lonely road. Looking around me, I tried to remember how I got here and where I was going. I just did not know. So as you can imagine, she was confused and at a loss, and she was quite relieved to see a light on the road ahead of her. It looked to her like someone was holding a lantern and swinging it back and forth, trying to get her to stop. So she did. She got out of the car, and this is when she saw 3 other cars pulled over. A man got out of the car in front of her, so Mimi at this point assumed there must be some kind of accident. But at this point, another man approached her, and he was unusual because he was wearing a white jumpsuit, much like an orderly from a hospital, she said. And he smiled at her and led her across the street into a field right by the road up to a brightly lit object. And to her amazement, it was a, quote, spaceship. And she now realized that the passengers from the other cars were also being led into it via a kind of staircase with about 14 steps. As Mimi says, I was amazed and frightened. No one seemed to say a word. It was so quiet. The man escorting me smiled and urged me to go forward, assuring me of my safety. So she wanted to ask all kinds of questions. She wondered what the other people were thinking, but she just felt like she couldn't resist. And once inside, she saw what looked like shiny metallic cabinets. Some were very plain, others looked like they had controls or gauges on top. And looking at the men in the white jumpsuits, she saw that they all looked very much alike. All of them were well over 6 feet tall. They all had high-domed, bald heads and looked quite young. She estimates about 30 years old. At one point, she believes she heard them speaking in an unfamiliar language. And as Mimi says, by now I assumed these were not Earth people, and that I may have been brought here with the other 3 gentlemen through some hypnotic means. Now she was more curious than afraid. She wanted to ask questions, but again found herself unable to do so. All she could do was watch. She said her mind raced as she tried to figure out what was going on. At some point she seemed to have a lapse in her memory, because the next thing she knew, one of the men was approaching her and told her, quote, "You will have no memory of anything you saw or experienced here. You will awaken with no memory of this experience." Now she and the other gentlemen were led back to their cars, and one by one they drove off. She was the last to leave. She found that suddenly her car lights were going on and that she was driving down the dark road. And as she says, quote, "Once again, I did not know where I was or how I got there. So I just drove, hoping to come to an intersection to give me bearings." And the next thing she knew, it was morning and she was waking up, remembering the above events. So she did not forget this. And as time passed, in fact, Mimi began to recall more of what happened. She recalled that one of the, quote, spacemen used this weird instrument, which she likened to a stethoscope, but it was not a stethoscope. It was quite small, it looked kind of transparent, was made of 3 sections. She could see what looked like filaments inside of it, and he used it to examine her. That's what her impression was. He held it to her head, her neck, her throat, her heart, her solar plexus, what she believed were her psychic centers. She did remember vividly that this instrument was cold enough that when it touched her throat, it caused her to wince. But as Mimi says, I had the feeling that the spaceman was putting these thoughts into my head like a doctor might talk during an operation. And again, she had the impression they were testing her somehow. She does also recall that at some point she was given what seemed to her to be a kind of remote viewing exercise, a psychic testing, where she was asked to communicate the contents of 4 envelopes, which she did. Now, according to Mimi, the first one held a kind of thesis about war and peace. The second one contained an image of a boat. She said the third one was some sort of mathematical equation, which did not make sense to her. She could not decipher it. And she said she easily saw the contents of the fourth one as well, which contained various seeds of corn, barley, oats, and rice. Now, per Mimi, she has had quite a few psychic experiences, including premonitions and out-of-body experiences, which certainly matches up with the reports of a lot of other contactees. Such an amazing case. I'm really fascinated by the psychic aspects of this case, because as we see, a lot of contactees, I'm going to say most of them, exhibit a wide variety of paranormal phenomena and psychic abilities. And that's certainly true of the witness in this case, Mimi Gorzel. I think it's an important and legitimate case. Now let's move to the next one. This one is really extensive. This one did get a lot of publicity, but unfortunately the publicity and the articles written about it were largely inaccurate. It's one of the reasons I really wanted to cover this case, which I call I Didn't Even Know What a UFO Was. The onboard UFO encounter of Carlos Alberto Diaz. This took place on January 5, 1975 in Puerto Ingeniero White. This is in Argentina, outside of Bahia Blanca. Don't confuse this with another case involving a gentleman of the same name. It is a different Carlos Diaz. But this case, is so unusual. I think it's a really important case because this was actually someone who was taken on board in full view of two witnesses. And most of the accounts in this case do not report that. The reporting on this was largely inaccurate until the witness came forward to correct a lot of the inaccuracies surrounding his case. The main witness in this case is Carlos Alberto Diaz. He worked as a railway worker, but did take a number of odd jobs. And again, this case got a lot of attention and press coverage. But quite a few of the articles and the reporting on this case contained inaccuracies, which are still being circulated even years later. Now, it was on the evening of January 4, 1975, that Carlos was leaving his night job as a waiter in a restaurant. He had just helped with a wedding, and it was now after midnight, January 5. He decided to buy a newspaper, and at 3:30 a.m. boarded a bus at the intersection of Colón and Estomba Avenues, which you can see here, got on the bus and got ready to go home. The bus arrived around 3:50, and he got off the bus where he met his two friends, Entrega and Miguel, who had also just gotten off work at another area. And all three were walking home together to a large desolate railway yard towards Daniel D. Solier Street, where Carlos lived. You can see that area here. And this is when they all three saw a very bright beam of light flash down, dazzling all three men. They thought for a second it might be lightning, but it didn't look like lightning. It was a hazy, the day was overcast, but this flash of light made no sound. There was no thunder. It did not appear to be lightning. And Carlos was only a short distance from his home when suddenly this white glowing object approached very quickly. Carlos didn't see it clearly, but his two friends thought momentarily it was a plane, but suddenly it raced at high speed directly overhead. And at this point, Carlos became immobilized. He could not move. He said a loud humming noise enveloped him. His friends did not feel this. They did not become immobilized. It was just Carlos. He was fully conscious when, without warning, he felt himself being drawn upwards into the sky. He reached about 10 feet into the air, and this is when he blacked out. Now his friends watched this happen and watched him get pulled up into this glowing object, which darted off. They were in absolute shock and disbelief and immediately ran to Carlos's home and woke up his wife, shouting hysterically to her, "Mirta, Mirta, Carlitos was taken by a flying saucer." So meanwhile, Carlos woke up and found himself inside this sort of round-shaped room. The walls, he said, were curved and glowing. It looked to him kind of like semi-transparent plastic. It was very small, no more than 10 feet wide, and there was nothing in there. No furnishings, no equipment, nothing but these kind of glowing walls. He did see a few holes through which he could feel air rushing in. He was half kneeling, half crouched. He was quite disoriented. He tried to get up and move around, but he found that any movement caused him to feel faint and nauseous, so he basically remained in the spot trying to orient himself. He did notice his shirt was missing, but as Carlos says, "I was desperate. I was screaming. I didn't even know what a UFO was. I felt nervous, afraid, I wanted to cry." It was almost immediately that three humanoid figures either entered or seemed to materialize. He's really not sure. But he could instantly see that they were not human. They had a kind of greenish color, very small heads, no visible facial features that he could see. He said they were about 5.5 feet tall with very slim, slender bodies. They seemed to be clothed or covered in some sort of a soft, cream-colored, smooth, rubbery outfit. They did have arms and legs, but Carlos couldn't see any hands on them. It looked almost like they ended in stumps. They did not bend, so perhaps these were robotic figures. But as Carlos said, they did not lean on each other to walk. They levitated. Now, to his dismay, these beings began to remove large clumps of hair from his head. Carlos fought and resisted, and he saw now that there were what looked like sucker-like protuberances on their arms, which they were apparently using to obtain hair samples from him. And they seemed to be quite excited about it as they would jump up and down after they got a sample, waving their arms. He says they moved slowly, but were exceedingly strong, such that Carlos was unable to stop them as they took samples from his chest hair as well. Now, he felt no pain whatsoever during this time, and as Carlos says, the body of the creatures seemed spongy. Every time I touched them, my hair fell out and stuck to them. So mind you, he's in a bit of a panic now. He's not observing super clearly, and after several moments of this, Carlos says his vision faded and he felt himself losing consciousness. And the next thing he knows, he's waking up in a grassy area with sunlight shining down on him. He's not sure where he is, but it's nowhere near his home. He looks at his watch. He could see that it stopped at 3:50 a.m. His bag containing his work clothes and the newspaper he had bought was lying next to him. He stood up. He was nauseous. He vomited a few times. And as it turns out, a man drove by and saw him, according to the first press accounts. This is not actually what happened. According to Carlos, he was actually in somebody's backyard, and this person's dogs were surrounding him, but not getting too close. And this person came out and saw Carlos, saw his disheveled condition, and took him to the police, who took him to a hospital, and he was eventually transferred to the Ferrovia Hospital in Buenos Aires. So Carlos now learned that he was quite distant from where he was taken, well over 700 kilometers, over 400 miles from where this craft had first appeared. His wife and family were called, and they, as you can imagine, were frantic with worry. Carlos had been missing all night, so they drove to the hospital, and Carlos said he would remain in this hospital for 17 days, or longer, not 4 days as was reported in most press accounts. Now, at the hospital and afterwards, Carlos was interviewed, interrogated, and examined at length by doctors, psychiatrists, psychoanalysts, UFO researchers, police. At least 46 different specialists examined and interviewed Carlos. It was interesting because a few of the doctors said that as they reached out to touch Carlos, they got a kind of electric shock from his body. Now, Carlos did his best to shun publicity. He refused most interviews. He wanted no attention. And this is what led to the many inaccuracies in the reporting of his case. The main one being that he was alone when he was taken, which he was not. His two friends saw this happen. Researcher Pedro Ramoniak interviewed him personally and said that Carlos was, quote, a nice, quiet young man, very modest, honest, and sincere. He verified that Carlos's hair had been cut in some areas and looked like it was pulled out down to the roots in others, but there was no damage whatsoever to the skin. This was something that baffled the doctors. He does have medical reports verifying this. Now, his case did cause some controversy, and there were some detractors, because later, researchers Roberto Enrique Banks and Richard W. Hayden, without actually interviewing Carlos at all and learning the full details of his case, wrote an article titled, Carlos Alberto Diaz was a hoaxer, and they based their conclusions that the site of where he was taken was always busy, and that nobody saw him being returned either. Turns out, no, the street where he was taken was not that busy. And again, this was 3 a.m., 4 a.m. They also said that the bus left Bahia Blanca at 3:30 and that Carlos was taken at 3:30, so the timing is incorrect. Well, actually, Carlos did get on the bus at 3:30, but he was taken at 3:50. So this doesn't pan out either. They accuse him actually of taking a train to Buenos Aires without any real reason for this. They then attacked his character, apparently disregarding the fact that researcher Pedro Ramoniuk found him to be an honest and sincere man, and that some 43 other professionals were absolutely convinced of the veracity of his case. So I think it's fair to say that this accusation of a hoax doesn't stand up under scrutiny. And in fact, more recently, researcher Ruben Rambola tracked down Carlos and confirmed the story. And he says, and I quote, "My conclusion is that the event was real without a doubt, with the people who were around Carlos being the best evidence and proof of the incident." Carlos himself has stuck to his story. As he says, "I've been telling what happened for 48 years, and I've never changed my version. I remember everything. I took it as a disgrace at the time." So yeah, he didn't want any publicity. And in fact, following the encounter and his return home, he suffered tremendous ridicule and was essentially ostracized by his neighbors and friends and constantly bothered by reporters to the point that it caused the breakup of his family. He and his wife became separated. Today, Carlos is now in his late 70s, and as he says, "Since this happened to me, I have never gotten sick again. Not a cold. I would not like to see them again. They didn't hurt me, but I just want to continue with my normal life." So yeah, apparently he got a huge health upgrade, which is something that does turn up in a number of cases. Truly amazing case. Kudos to Carlos Alberto Diaz for coming forward. He didn't want to. He never sought any publicity, never received any money for his case. It really upturned his life in a number of ways. It was a very difficult experience for him, though ultimately he says it wasn't a negative experience. And as we have seen, he did benefit in some really remarkable ways in terms of his health. So, an important case, no doubt. And now we move to the next case, which I call Taken from the Backyard. This is the onboard UFO encounter of Vladimir Karatonov. This one took place on January 15, 1978, near Pskov, Russia. And it's a fascinating encounter of a gentleman who met human-looking ETs and was taken on board. This very unusual case comes from Russian researcher Solomon Shulman and was published in his book Extraterrestrials Over Russia, Stunning Facts and New Hypotheses. It was about 8 p.m., January 15, 1978, and the witness, a student by the name of Vladimir Sergeyevich Karatonov, was visiting his parents near their home in Pskov, Russia. It was about 8 p.m. again on a clear moonlit night as Vladimir stepped outside in the backyard, and to his shock he noticed 3 strange people in the yard. And apparently thinking they were trespassing, he approached them and asked them angrily, "What are you doing here?" And as he got close enough to see their faces, he got a real shock because they did not appear to be normal people. Their faces were covered by a weird sort of intricate lattice which looked to him like it was made of smooth fabric, and it obscured all their facial features. Only their chins were visible. He could see that they were of normal height, slim but well built, he said, and all of them were wearing tight-fitting, full-body suits, which shone like polished titanium, kind of metallic looking, no visible seams, no buttons, no markings of any kind. One did appear to be a woman, as she had long hair down to the middle of her back. But most shocking was that just a few feet behind them, near a large pile of logs, Vladimir saw a strange craft, which was quite small, about the size of a car. It was roundish, no sharp edges, dark in color, though it did have a transparent dome on top, was slightly off-center, about 6 feet wide, 4 feet high, and one of the men who Vladimir perceived to be the leader invited Vladimir to join them and go inside the craft, and opened a door, and all of them went inside. So venturing inside this craft, Vladimir was surprised to see that it was actually quite spacious, apparently bigger on the inside than on the outside. He saw that there were soft, comfortable seats for all of them. The leader sat in the front of the craft. Vladimir sat behind this man and next to the two other beings. The leader reached out and manually closed the door, which made no sound, but it felt like to Vladimir that it sort of protected the environment. So they sat there not moving for a full minute, during which time Vladimir looked around and saw what appeared to be a sort of white, yellow, shiny control panel. It looked like it had 9 rows of buttons. He counted 9 rows with 25 buttons in each row. At this point, the leader began to press various buttons on this panel, at which time Vladimir noticed that their fingers were a little bit different in some way from a normal person's, though this was not described in any detail. But at this point, the craft began to rise slowly upwards, rotating on its axis, and looking outside, Vladimir saw that they were rising up. He saw the houses and cars and roads below him, and he says the craft rose about 120 feet up into the air, then turned to the west. The crew of the craft was totally silent and appeared to be paying no attention whatsoever to Vladimir. Then, suddenly the craft accelerated sharply upwards. Per Vladimir, he could feel the effects of this sudden acceleration, and it frightened him. And it now suddenly occurred to him that he might be being taken away. And he promptly reached out in sort of a panic and punched the leader in the head. Following this, he immediately blacked out, and his next memory was waking up lying on the pile of logs in the backyard of his parents' home where he had first seen this craft. So interesting. And again, kudos to Vladimir for stepping forward. The vast majority of people don't. I totally understand why, especially with all the confusion and fear and ridicule and skepticism surrounding this phenomenon. Thankfully, things are changing and people are now finding the courage to step forward in much larger numbers, though it's still clear that the vast majority do not. I think this case is also important because it shows how not to react by punching an ET in the head. I wonder what would have happened if he hadn't done that. I mean, it's possible he might not have been returned. So perhaps it was to his benefit, we don't know. But it might have turned out to be a much more extensive encounter and he could have learned a whole lot more. All pure speculation, but certainly a fascinating account. And now let's move to the last one in this little collection of 7 cases. I call this one Psychoanalyzed by the Greys, the onboard UFO encounter of Brian X. That is a pseudonym. He does not want his real name used. He's anonymous. This case took place on February 24, 2011, not too long ago, at Lee Summit, Missouri. And this is a super fascinating case because he verifies some of the aspects that I think a lot of contactees are now becoming aware of, and that is that these craft themselves are living beings. This very interesting case comes from the UFO group, UFOs Northwest, and was also published in Albert Rosales' book, Humanoid Encounters, The Others Amongst Us, the 2010 to 2015 version. Now the witness in this case is anonymous. We'll call him Brian. This is a pseudonym. He's a gentleman from Lee Summit, Missouri. It was on the evening of February 24, 2011, and he was trapped in his apartment by a bad snowstorm. And it was during this time, he says, he had a missing time incident. This took him some time to recall, but he recalled it naturally without the aid of hypnosis. Per Brian, this encounter began when a red-purple light was shining on his face in bed, and it seemed to nullify him or put him into a trance. More colored lights appeared, blue and yellow, flashing in his face, and this is when he felt a small hand take his and lead him from his apartment and somehow into a craft. He never saw the craft from the outside, this was his impression, but he did open his eyes inside, and once inside he immediately had the sense that the craft that he was inside was actually alive, sort of biomechanical in nature, is how he put it. It seemed to be almost pulsing with a heartbeat. He saw what looked like, quote, blue streamlined lights running through the inside of the ship, kind of reminding him of veins, but he could now see 3 or 4 typical gray ETs, with the gray skin, the large heads, the big black eyes, skinny bodies. And per Brian, they had him sit on a flat rectangular table. And again, he had a very strong impression that the whole craft was alive and that this table was part of the craft. He had the impressions that the whole ship was not only organic, but was linked to the advanced thoughts of the ETs, who he could tell were very highly evolved. At this point, he had this sense that the ship was hovering. He says he felt the gravity was slightly above normal. He says at this point, the Greys started staring at him with their large, dark eyes, and he felt like they were kind of psychoanalyzing him, going through all his memories, both good and bad memories. And he says he almost felt like they were veterinarians treating him like an animal, but he sensed that they were not there to harm him in any way. In fact, the opposite. He felt like they were there to help him, that they were in some way programming parts of his life in an attempt to improve his life in some way. He did recall that one of these Greys was female and had, instead of gray skin, more beige skin. But the next thing he knew, he woke up and he was lying on top of his bed sheets, and his cat was hiding in the closet. He didn't remember hardly any of this at first, but over the days and weeks that followed, his memory came back to him. And as it turns out, there were other encounters in the area. In fact, only a few months later, on May 15th, 2011, a group of people were driving west on Woods Chapel Road towards Highway 470 when they saw a classic metallic, saucer-shaped craft hovering at low level overhead. As one of the witnesses says, all of us couldn't believe what we were seeing. Everyone is asking, are you seeing what I'm seeing? I kept saying, oh my God, oh my God. I'm so mad we didn't pull over and take pictures, although I'm not sure how well the pictures would have turned out because we didn't have actual cameras, just our phones. Now, she did find a photograph of a craft which looked very much like the one she saw, as you can see here. But as the witness says, of course, lots of people don't believe us and are assuming it was a blimp or a helicopter. But all of us saw the exact same thing. There's no doubt in our minds that it was an ET UFO. None of us have ever seen an aircraft like that before. So there you go. That's a fairly straightforward case. What I like about it is that this witness did recall this experience on his own, as did all the witnesses in this collection. It's an important detail because people who are skeptical often say, well, they recalled this under hypnosis. Not true. All these people had fully conscious encounters. They might not have remembered everything, but they certainly remembered a lot. And that is fascinating to me because we can say with absolute certainty that these onboard encounters do not rely on hypnotic recall. While some do, many don't. And those that do or don't match up perfectly. So it's clear that hypnosis does work. But I love these fully conscious onboard cases because they have a lot of information to them. I think these 7 cases I've presented today do give an accurate cross-section of what it's like to be taken on board, meet ETs face to face, even in one case apparently going to another planet, being physically examined by the ETs, holding conversations with them. It's all just plain fascinating stuff. There's no doubt in my mind that these kinds of things do happen. I mean, you could certainly dismiss one case, or even 10, or even 100. But the fact is there are thousands upon thousands of cases like these. I've said it so many times. While there are multiple witness cases, and there's all kinds of evidence, such as radar returns and photographs and landing traces and physiological effects and animal reactions and electromagnetic disturbances and implant removals and more, the best evidence is the huge number of cases reaching back decades, coming from all over the world, cases that have incredible commonalities that virtually exclude any possibility of these being explained as hoaxes, hallucinations, misperceptions, or mental illness, which our governments are trying so hard to make people believe. I still get pushback today from skeptics who try to assert these explanations for UFO contact, and it's ridiculous because the fact is there are far too many cases to explain that way. That's why this subject is so important. We all need to know that we are not alone in this universe. That is one of the main goals or agendas of ETs, is just to let us know that we aren't alone. So thank you once again for watching. I truly appreciate it, you guys. This subject is so important. I think it has the potential to really change the world. It's going mainstream. It's a new era for humanity. One of these days, this cover-up is just going to crumble under the weight of its own lies, and we will have truth and transparency with this subject. Don't think our governments will ever willingly do it, but I think disclosure is inevitable for one simple fact. UFOs are real. And that is all we need to know. We don't need to have our lying governments tell us what we already know. So thank you again. Truly appreciate it. Until next time, keep asking those hard questions, keep searching for the truth, and most important of all, keep having fun and have a happy new year. Bye for now. See you next Friday.